Hello and welcome to episode 50, the Big 50 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we're actually recapping 2 weeks. We missed last week because of the holiday and I was out of town and stuff. But we're back. We're here to talk about the Call of Duty League's final 2 weeks of online play. So no more online Vanguard unless you're one of those lowly challengers players that has to go through the qualifiers. But for the pros, that they're finally done with online play, and now they just focus on the final 2 events of the season. And for some of these teams, it will just be their final event, and that is the 4th Call of Duty League Major, which is coming up this week in Brooklyn, in New York. But before we talk about any of that stuff, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing well. Like we said, we weren't here last week, so we got a little extra Call of Duty to talk about, but that never hurt anybody, and looking forward to this upcoming weekend and just the event this week and the impending end of the Vanguard season.
Yeah, let's just hop right into it because we have so much to cover, and I don't want to harp too much on the online stuff, because really what is important is how these teams perform at the major and how many points they pick up at the major. And then if they do qualify, we can talk about champs as well, because that's quickly approaching, and this is the most exciting part of the CDL season, as we've seen with these most recent online qualifier matches. Teams are actually taking it very seriously. Everything seems to mean more because of how tight the standings are. But to quickly recap the qualifying matches that we missed from last week's episode, or the last week's, what would have been our last week's episode, I'm just going to quickly go through the results of the matches that we missed. So Atlanta beat Toronto 3-0. Minnesota lost to London 3-1. Boston upset Seattle 3-1. Those were on the Friday matches. Saturday we had 4 matches. London 3-1 over Florida. OpTic 3-1 over Paris. New York 3-1 over Seattle, and another 3-1 LAG beating the Atlanta FaZe. And then on Sunday, the final 3 matches of that week were Boston 3-1 over LAG. LAT, they swept the Paris Legion, and the New York Subliners kept their undefeated streak alive with a 3-1 win over OpTic. And then do you want to roll through these results for the week that we just got done with, the online results?
Yes, sir. We just, this past Friday, July 8th, we had London beating Atlanta 3-1. Kind of a surprise there, even though London had been playing well in the matches. Florida beating Paris 3-2. Probably just a little surprising that it wasn't a 3-0 going up against Paris, but Paris had a decent turnaround this week. Then the last match on Friday was Minnesota 3-2 over Seattle. Seattle's recent struggles continued there. Then we had Saturday, July 9th, which started with Minnesota beating Paris 3-2, another close series for Paris that they end up losing. Boston beat Toronto 3-2, Methods getting a little bit of revenge over his former team. Florida then beat LAT 3-2, so probably an upset in the eyes of a couple people. And the big one, Atlanta versus Seattle. Atlanta wins 3-0, which might have been one of the first times Atlanta actually beat Seattle. Not 100% sure there, but I know Seattle's had their number this year. And finally, the last 3 CDL online qualifier matches of the Vanguard season on Sunday, July 10th. We had LAG 3-2 London, Toronto 3-2 OpTic. Those were both reverse sweeps. And LAT 3-2 New York to close out the qualifiers for Major 4.
Yeah, we kind of sucked on the predictions over the past 2 weeks. This was actually the first time that we didn't hit 500 in our predictions. You were 8-12. I was 7-13. So you're 5 matches ahead. You're 93-71. I'm 88-76 on the season. The reason that we flew through those, and usually we spend a little bit of time on the qualifying matches, and then we kind of breeze through the predictions for the next week, is because we're probably going to talk about all of these teams at some point during the show as we preview this major, because we're not going to really go like match by match on the major bracket, but we're more going to talk about how these teams are heading into the major, and definitely look at the standings of like what needs to happen for them to ensure a spot at the 8-team Call of Duty League Championship, which is coming up next month in Los Angeles. So let's bring up the standings real quick. I have it here. I'll bring it up on screen for anybody watching on Twitch. We're streaming live on Twitch, and we're also going to put this on YouTube as usual. So if you are interested in the video version, you can check that out. But the audio version will fly through it anyway. Let me bring that up real quick. But Atlanta FaZe, no surprise, they're the number 1 team right now. It's on the screen now. Atlanta FaZe, they've been in the number 1 spot of the CDL standings for pretty much the entire season at this point. Other than like maybe a little bit at the beginning of the season when OpTic won the first major, but FaZe has a 55-point lead over OpTic Texas, who have really struggled lately in the qualifying matches, but they're still holding a pretty good lead in over third place, which is London. London has a 5-point lead over Seattle. Seattle has a 15-point lead over Boston, and then Toronto is in 6th, LAT is in 7th, and then the Gorillas have managed to hang on to their 8th place spot currently. I believe that they briefly fell out of 8th at one point, and I think Minnesota was technically 8th, but with that, they picked up a win, and it's helped them get a 5-point lead over the Minnesota Rocker, who are tied for 9th place with the Florida Mutineers. They're just 5 points back of LAG. And then New York, who has made this incredible run over these last 5 qualifying matches, they're 35 points back of LAG. And then the Paris Legion are, they're not going to champs. They're not winning champs because they're not going to champs. They won only 2 matches. They could win more, but they only won 2 matches so far this season. That's only 20 points, and they can't make up that ground, that 125-point gap at the major alone. So they are officially eliminated from playoff contention. How do you want to do this? Do you want to talk about a specific team first, or do you want to look at the major bracket and figure out from there?
I just real quick, just because it was the last match of the qualifiers, and
Yep.
we kind of, we glossed over it, but just looking at the standings now, that last match of the qualifiers was LAT versus New York,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't have the standings for just the major 4 qualifiers, but I believe New York was 4-0 because I'm pretty sure they only had 70 CDL points.
Yeah.
Heading into like these qualifiers, so the 70 plus 40 would be given the 110. So that was such a huge win for LA Thieves, because if you just change the standings up a little bit based on that, the Gorillas would be in 7th at 145. Then it would be the Thieves, Minnesota, and Florida all at 140, and New York only 20 behind at 120. So that was a massive win for the Thieves. Pretty much a heartbreaking loss for New York. Just makes their task a little bit tougher at their home major, but that would have been super spicy heading into the major to have 3 teams at 140, with 140 technically having the hold of 8th place at that time, and New York only being 20 points back. 20 points, obviously the number being smaller means it's more attainable, but 20 definitely feels like it's a much easier gap to close than 30, just based on the point distribution at these majors. So that's the only thing most notably to me on these standings. We'll also point out that Atlanta and OpTic are the 2 teams that have qualified for champs already,
Yep.
which means that, despite some of these other teams like towards the top, like London jumping up there at 180 or 190, sorry, and Seattle at 185, that means that's not even, locked them in yet. So we're set up for a good week here at the major, and a lot of stuff could go down.
Yeah, definitely. I also think LAT, with that win over New York, that ensured that they were going to be in the winners bracket of this major, or at least, if they were going to be in the winners bracket, they're in a better spot now because they got that an additional win at the end of the season, and that spot could help them just make it one further round, maybe 10 more points, and that'll help them hold on to a spot. But definitely this major has, everything that you would want in a high stakes double elimination tournament. There are pretty much the entire league is still fighting for a spot at champs. Like you said, London, they have a decent lead over 8th place, so they're not in too much danger, but it's still a possibility that they could fall out of the top 8, which is kind of crazy that the 3rd place team and the team that has basically been in 3rd for almost this entire season, save for maybe like a few weeks where Seattle made a push, but London has been a really consistent team in the standings, but there's still a chance that they won't make it to champs come August. So a really interesting development there. And that just shows how important these regular season, these online matches, unfortunately, are for some of these teams. I'm sure the Gorillas are hating that their season has been really put in jeopardy because they've had to go through so many of these online matches. But currently they are they control their own destiny, but it's going to be tough considering they are starting in the losers bracket of the major. But let's look at the major bracket. It's on the screen now. If you've been watching any of been following the Call of Duty League, you kind of know how it goes now. The top 8 teams from the qualifying matches start in the winners bracket, and those bottom 4 teams, so in this case, it's the Los Angeles Guerrillas, Paris Legion, OpTic Texas, and Seattle Surge. Those 4 teams start in the losers bracket, meaning one loss and they're out. They don't get that added advantage of maybe slipping up in a winners bracket round 1 or round 2 match, and then they can fight their way through the losers bracket. They're forced to do it all the way through. How do you want to do this? Do you want to talk about some of these teams as we progress through our major preview?
Yeah, that's fine. I think one thing I'll just kick things off with, and we can go from here. Interesting side note about this bracket in particular is that obviously this is the 4th major, and we've had 3 major winners before this, all different.
Yep.
And all 3 of them are starting this major in the losers bracket. So, you can chalk that up to, not going to say the flukiness, but just the nature of the beast that is Vanguard. Seems to be some finicky stuff that could, at times have more of an impact on results than other people might think, all that yada yada. But end of the day, the fact remains that we've had 3 majors so far this year already, 3 different winners at all 3 majors, and in the final one before champs, they're all starting in the losers bracket.
I think that's an important part of it too. Like, I know that Slasher has made the comment, like he pointed out that all of the major champions are in the losers bracket. I think maybe Seattle has the best, maybe the best excuse is like, this is online. We've proven that we're a good LAN team. I don't know if LAG really has that excuse because they've looked pretty bad, like throughout the entire season, like barring one event. So I would just say like LAG of all of those teams, well, the Legion deserved to be there, and I think LAG deserved to be there pretty much just as much as Paris. But go ahead.
No, I don't have anything. I was just gonna kick things off with OpTic because we were starting down here in the losers bracket. I'm trying to just find the exact standings for the qualifiers because I don't have them. So yeah, I'm on COD Gamepedia now, and I guess based on the final standings, OpTic would have went 1-4 in the qualifiers. I believe that means they started 0-2 the first week of the qualifiers. Then Illy came back. They had a win. Their win would have been against Paris. right? Yeah, so they beat Paris 3-1 in Illy's return, but that still means they went 1-2 with that win being against Paris. So take that for what you will. But OpTic currently aren't in the best form, obviously, as evidenced by their starting in the losers bracket here at the upcoming major. But we have talked a couple times now on the podcast, just based on this whole situation with Illy and ProLoot and all that. Um, in my eyes at least, the goal for them, just due to their position, having won that first major and having, not at the time, but now they have qualified for champs. That their goal this whole point and at this major is just to prepare for champs and to try to get Illy in form uh, heading into champs. Not to say that Illy wasn't in form in the matches. I would have to go back and look at the stats and all that. But you know what I'm trying to say. Just get the squad back to the point they were at when they won Major 1, because the big one at the end of the year is all most people really care about. So, and certainly OpTic fans are super anxious to have another world championship and under the green wall. So, just, nothing too much on my end to note about OpTic's performance in particular. I think it's obviously not ideal for them to be in the losers bracket for multiple reasons, including, the stream's viewership of the tournament, and just, the lack of them being guaranteed a certain number of matches. But end of the day, that's the position they're in. They're gonna have to try to get as much practice as they can on land at this tournament. So try to prolong their run as long as they can, get that practice in, and then try and head into champs with a little bit of momentum if possible.
Yeah, I think in the first half of the season, they were an excellent control team. I just looked it up. They were 16-1 in control in the first half of the season. That's ridiculous. That's pretty much a guaranteed W, at least in one of the first 3 maps. And obviously, if you're going to win one map almost guaranteed, then that's an increased percentage of you winning the series. And they were good in a hardpoint and search and destroy. As far as I can tell from their back half of the season, which, has to be said that ProLoot was a part of that roster for a good chunk of it. And they've been reintegrating Illy back into the roster, so that's going to take a little bit of time, but it really hasn't affected their hardpoint and search and destroy wins as much as it has affected their control wins. They're still above 500 in every one of their game modes, but control, they're 8-5. Obviously, that's a far cry from being 16-1 in the first half of the season. So take that as you will. I think they're still a very good pick to win the major if they're able to just find a little bit of momentum. Maybe it's going to be a tough matchup regardless, whether it's New York or Minnesota. But we've seen OpTic make some impressive loser bracket runs before. We've seen some teams already this season, including the Gorillas, make an incredible run from losers bracket round 1. So I think if any team could do it, it's OpTic, but it's going to be tough for them because it's a tough position to be put in. But like you said, this is not the ultimate goal. Winning Major 4 is not the pinnacle for OpTic. That's winning champs, and I'm sure FaZe feels the same way. That even if they maybe they make it to a 4th consecutive major grand finals and lose, that would suck, obviously. But at the end of the day, it's really important for these teams and all of the teams really to just perform as well as they can and put themselves in the best possible position for champs next month. Yep. And as far as OpTic goes, like I said, they're going to have to play New York or Minnesota. I want to talk about New York real quick because they've been kind of the biggest storyline, in my opinion, over these past 2 or 3 weeks, because they were in 11th place. They still are in 11th place, but they've made an incredible run. They won 4 of their 5 qualifying matches, and they're starting in the winner's bracket of the major. But these majors have been the bane of their existence so far. I don't believe they picked up a single point at any of the first three majors, and that's really hurt them because they performed pretty well in the qualifying matches of each of the three stages, and they did so again. But if they can't pick up, I believe it's like at least 35 points, or I believe 35 points back of eighth place, that they have no shot at making it. What do you think of New York over these last 2 weeks, since we really haven't talked about them since 2-3 weeks ago?
I am all in on the Subliners right now. I think I'm all aboard that train for this storyline. I think it's super cool. The Cinderella run would be so impressive if they're able to pull this off. Like you said, they've struggled at the majors so far, so that could be an important note. But they absolutely have the chance to control their own destiny just looking at this bracket. So we talked about the standings, right? With Minnesota and Florida being 30 points ahead of them. The LAG are 35 points ahead of them. LAG is starting in the loser bracket, so they are, in danger of not getting any points. They just go one and done here, right? New York is playing Minnesota, one of the teams directly ahead of them, so they have the chance to, send them down to the losers bracket, potentially having them not get 0 points or get 0 points as well. And then to follow that up, they play the winner of Breach versus Florida. So even in a scenario where, like New York's rooting for Florida to lose that match for the overall point scenario, but even in a situation where Florida beats Breach and New York beats Minnesota, that sets up another opportunity for New York to again control its own destiny and potentially send Florida down to the losers bracket, get them, a little higher in the final placings to get them as many points as possible. So they are in a really good position here to, as much as they are kind of, I don't, on the back foot isn't the right term, but they're at a deficit due to their position in the standings. And it could be like if they're on the other side of the bracket, they could be in a position where they don't play Minnesota or potentially Florida at all, right? But in this scenario, they have absolutely the best chance they could to potentially control their own destiny as much as possible due to the situation they've created throughout the year with all the roster changes and all that stuff earlier. They can put that in the rearview mirror and just focus on this tournament. And if they go out and go on a good run at their own major, it would be such a cool storyline. And obviously, we've talked about potentially Crim Six missing champs for the first time in his career. It would be weird to not have him there. So I think I'm all in on this storyline for New York, and I'm really pulling for them at this tournament. I think it'd be a really cool storyline and something I'm certainly going to have my eyes on all weekend.
Because they're 35 points back, they're going to have to at least finish third at the event. Any worse than that, they can't reach LAG in eighth place. Obviously, if LAG wins a match, things change. If Florida or Minnesota ahead of them, they win matches, it could change as well. But they need at least third place, which would put them 5 points ahead of where LAG is currently. Second place would put them 15 points ahead, and then a championship, which would be an incredible feat, that would put them, I believe, 20 points ahead of where LAG currently stands. Obviously, like I said, things can change very quickly with LAG. If they make a run, they almost certainly shut the door on the Subliners, unless the Subliners make some incredible run as well and they're able to knock out LAG or something, or LAG gets knocked out relatively early. It's a lot, but LAG, as I've said, I said in the last episode, and I'll say it again, they're really not that good. They haven't played very well at all this season. And it's very possible that they make another run at the championship like they did in Major 2, but I think the odds are that they won't. And it would really help them, obviously, if they did, though, because that 5-point lead, it's not safe. Like, it's with how Florida plays, like Florida's erratic, Florida's unpredictable or whatever, but they usually win at least one match at the majors. And Minnesota, who knows? They had that incredible stretch of games in the qualifying matches before Major 3, and then they kind of laid an egg in Major 3 in the tournament. So I'm not really sure what to expect, especially when Minnesota's playing New York in the winners bracket round 1. It's just kind of unpredictable. Is there another team that you want to talk about? Because, we've talked about New York, we've talked about OpTic. I don't know how much we really need to talk about the Paris Legion. It's been a really disappointing run for them, and their season officially came to or not their season, but their chances at extending their season, that came to an end, pretty recently, but it was pretty much determined relatively early on in the stage that they would have to play out of their minds in the qualifying matches and at the major to really even have a shot of like what New York is doing, where they still have to do really well at the major despite playing incredibly well in the qualifying matches.
Yeah, I don't think we have to talk about Paris too much. I think the one note we will bring up is we talked about questioning the move to bring Johnny in at this point in the season heading into these qualifiers. He's certainly had some moments where, he's played well in Search and Destroy in particular, I feel like, but he's also had some very rough respawn maps just off the top of my head, thinking back on his KDs and some of the qualifiers. So, it looks like at this point, Paris going 0-5 at this point, or at this set of qualifiers, excuse me. Basically matched away from being eliminated. Who are they going to? So they would play the loser of LA Thieves or Atlanta. That's a tough matchup for them no matter what. So fully expecting Paris' season to come to end in the first round here of this major, and then I think just after that, it's going to be time to hit the reset button, probably do a clean wipe, and try and start fresh with their Las Vegas tenure.
Yeah, we don't have to talk about it now because we have an incredible off season ahead, and I'm sure we'll talk about it then. But Kismet, who's currently with the Subliners, and he was on the Paris Legion's inaugural roster in 2020, he had some, words and some thoughts on Paris and their owner, from his time playing with them. So we'll talk about it in the off season, but I think it's going to be an eventful. I'm really excited to see what Paris or what Las Vegas does in the off season. Whether they decide, maybe we're going to spend a little bit of money, maybe we're going to try to build a competitive roster. I'm interested to see what happens, but it's pretty much the end of the road for the Paris Legion as we know it, because they're going to have a tough matchup regardless of who ends up playing them. Let's talk about the Seattle Surge, because that was the Major 3 champion. Kind of came out of nowhere, just really hit their stride in the end of the qualifying matches in Major 3, and then in the tournament in Toronto, they ended up winning, beating Atlanta FaZe in the finals. But they find themselves in the losers bracket to start this event, and despite being in fourth, like we've talked about, they're still not safe. They could. It's a possibility that they fall out of the top 8 and don't make champs. So what have you been making of Seattle's performances over the past few weeks?
Yeah, I think that just overall, the one thing we've talked about with Seattle since this roster was formed is just the consistency. They had, obviously, they looked really good at the Pro-Am to start the year. Then they had that little stretch, I think, towards the end of the qualifiers and heading into Major 1 where they lost a bunch of series in a row. So they've shown us, kind of like we've talked about with Florida at multiple points throughout the CDL and many seasons now. It's just a consistency thing. You don't know which Seattle you're going to get. Obviously, the team has the potential to win a major, as they showed in the last one, and they very clearly also had the potential to go 1-4 and set a qualifier. So Certainly not the position they wanted to be in, I would assume, heading or following a successful run at the major. You would have liked them to see them to continue their momentum and build on a championship rather than kind of regress a little bit. But you did bring up the point, of LAN versus online. So it will be interesting to see if we do end up seeing a different form of Seattle here in the uh, loser bracket of Major Four. They will be playing the loser of Boston versus Florida. I think either of those teams drops down. It's a very winnable matchup if Seattle's playing at the top of their game and what we know is capable of them. At the same time, it's a very losable matchup for Seattle if they come out and they're not firing on all cylinders or something is off with the squad. So will be interesting to see what Seattle shows up to this event. But obviously, they haven't secured their spot at champs, but they are in a position where they're in the top 4 of the standings right now. So, barring everyone below them, just going on crazy runs, they should be able to lock in a spot, even in a worst case scenario where they get eliminated in the first round of the losers bracket here. But end of the day, they don't want to do that. They want to try and get as many points. That's it sucks to be starting in the losers bracket. That's the position they earn, so nothing they can do about that. But they can try to remedy the situation as best they can by coming out and trying to get a couple points here to just try to get into that champ spot for sure.
Yeah, the Surge, they won 9 consecutive matches between the first week of the Major 3 qualifiers and then through the first week of the Major 4 qualifiers. So that was, like over a month stretch where they didn't lose a match. But the last 4 matches of the Major 4 qualifiers were all losses. They lost to Boston, New York, Minnesota, and then they finish out the regular season with a 3-0 loss to Atlanta, who, like you mentioned earlier in the episode, Seattle's kind of had Atlanta's number. FaZe has struggled, particularly with 2 teams this season. That's been Seattle and OpTic. And fortunately for Atlanta, both of those teams have been trending downward recently. I don't know if that could really help Atlanta. I don't know if they'll struggle with some of the other teams that have been playing pretty well lately. But I think it's interesting that Seattle, they had this little hiccup in the beginning of the season, and they're having it at the end of the season. I'm not sure exactly what it is. Maybe it's just Vanguard being Vanguard and things just, it's impossible to really predict on what kind of game you're going to be playing on a daily basis. But I don't know. I hate making those excuses. I know that they're valid, but I just hate it because then what's the point of even like criticizing teams, analyzing what they're doing, if it's just going to be like it's just a game, we can't control it or whatever. So I think some blame actually has to fall on Seattle and the team and the coaching staff and whatnot, just because, it's 4 straight losses, probably 5 straight losses if they don't play Paris in the first match, because, Paris is pretty much an automatic win for any team in the league. So, any other team in the CDL, probably it might have been a loss. I don't know. But, Seattle definitely having a really tough stretch heading into the 4th major, and this is the worst possible time to not have like any sort of momentum or maybe even a lack of confidence in how far this team could go, because there's a multi-million-dollar tournament, a life-changing event around the corner that you definitely want to be performing your best at. And it just looks like Seattle, they're like OpTic, they're just kind of, not doing really well, and they're possibly kind of costing themselves at a really, really big tournament in a month. I think we covered all the. We did talk about the Gorillas. We talked about OpTic, we talked about Paris, we talked about Seattle. So we got through all the losers bracket teams. Let's talk about a little bit more about the winners bracket teams. I want to start at the top of the standings. Atlanta FaZe, they have been in each of the first 3 major grand finals, which is an incredible feat. But they've lost all 3 major grand finals, despite being at the top of the standings. What have you been making of FaZe's play of late? Obviously, they swept Seattle to finish off the season for Seattle's part. But what do you make of the Atlanta FaZe?
Yeah, they had some, a little bit of blips here and there. What was it? It was the 3 they lost to, where is it? And the results, I think, yeah, they lost 3-1 to the Gorillas. Obviously, any loss of Atlanta against the Gorillas is kind of surprising. To see a 3-1, that was super surprising to me. And then they also lost to London. London's just been playing really well in this set of qualifiers. So, I mean, that's still surprising, but not particularly extremely surprising just based on their performance recently. Aside from that, though, I still think Atlanta has got to be looked at as one of the contenders for winning this whole thing, especially just based on their most recent match, which would have been this past Saturday against Seattle. Like you said, a 3-0 for them against Seattle. Seattle is possibly struggling, but even when Seattle was, being up and down early in the season, Seattle still was performing well and taking down Atlanta. So I think that's a big turnaround win for Atlanta, despite, recent circumstances. They've been playing well in search, I feel like, throughout this recent qualifiers, and Celium in particular. I just think he's the best player in the game right now. So having Atlanta reach their 4th consecutive final of the Vanguard season would not be very surprising to me, despite, some recent losses and all that. I think it might be a little tough based on their bracket, because in a scenario where they have to play against London in that second round of the winners bracket, that's a match we just most recently saw with London beating Atlanta. So could be tough for them there. But I still, as we've said multiple times on this podcast, they're the most talented roster, and I firmly believe in Atlanta still. And I was talking to Jim earlier in the week, getting a little ahead of myself here, but I feel like my try-hard prediction for who will win Major 4 is still Atlanta, going for maximum content or the best storyline angle. I think New York taking the major would be super cool. But, that stuff aside, I still think Atlanta's in a good position to take this one home, and it would be fitting for them to reach the major, or reach the finals of all 4 majors, and finally get it done in the last one. But I guess in the same sense, it would be even more fitting if they do reach the finals of Major 4, end up losing again in the finals to get their 4th straight second place, and then rebound from that to reach the finals of champs and take home the world championship again. The Atlanta guys would probably, those 2 scenarios, they would probably go with the winning champs one, I would have to assume. But
Probably.
all that aside, yeah, I still just think Atlanta obviously unquestionably has the potential to be the best team in the game. It's just going to come down to whether they show that potential here at the major.
Yeah, and I think the schedule part of it, or the way the bracket is set up for Atlanta, really works out. They play LAT in the first round. They're 4-0 against LAT this season. If they play Toronto in the second round, they're 6-0 against Toronto this season. They have lost once to London so far this season, but they're 2-1. But this is the thing, like FaZe, I don't want to say is like lucky, but I would say that OpTic and Seattle have been their 2 biggest challenges this season.
Sure.
And both of those teams are in the losers bracket. If Atlanta keeps winning, then the only spot that they could actually play those teams is the grand finals. And I'm sure FaZe wants to beat them. I'm sure they want to win the grand finals, but at the same time, it's all right if they lost that, because then it just seems like, all right, like we have another thing we have to learn to beat these two teams. And it's obviously not very likely that either of those teams would make it to the grand finals from losers bracket round one. So I do think FaZe, they have a pretty good setup, at least in the first two rounds, but things always change. Teams get upset at majors. It's not unheard of. FaZe typically doesn't, but it can still happen. I believe they did, like in Major 4 last season. They had a hiccup and they went out like in top 6 or something like that. So it's happened before, and it's happened to a lot of good teams. But I still stand by that FaZe. It's a good pick for them to win the championship, or win the Major 4 championship, excuse me, because they're an incredible team that has a lot of chemistry, and they've proven time and time again that you really can't pick against them like more times than not. Even if you pick Seattle against them, like I did, this past week in the qualifiers, I probably shouldn't have done that. I probably should have picked FaZe. They're an incredible team, and I think any person trying to figure out a winner for Major 4, you have to at least consider Atlanta FaZe. Their opponent, LAT, been a weird season for them. I expected a lot better out of them pretty much this entire year, and they really haven't been able to find any firm footing at all this season. Currently in 7th place, but in pretty big danger of falling out of the top 8 with how close Minnesota and Florida are in 9th and 10th, and they're like 5 points ahead of LAG in 8th place. So they're in danger. Have you thought about LAT at all, about how they've been progressing this season, how they're looking heading into definitely the most important stretch of this entire year?
I think, all things considered, they, are looking better than they have at other points in this season. Certainly, went 3-2 in the qualifiers, as we already talked about, that big win over New York most recently, and had a 13-8 map count in these qualifiers. That's a respectable record, certainly. So,
Mm-hmm.
there's been a ton of talk about the Thieves all season, with everything from the roster underperforming in the eyes of some people to Kenny making the role swap back to a sub. Just a ton of things, and it just hasn't really ever clicked all together. I feel like, did they come top 4 in the last major? I think Toronto came in 3rd. They might have came in 4th. I'm gonna look real quick because I can't remember. But outside of that, it's been another, just, I would say, a disappointing year for the Thieves organization. Yeah, they came in 4th, Major 3, top 8, Major 2, and top 6, Major 1. So yeah, it's just been, that's, the Thieves coming from a spot where, well, there's an argument in itself of when the Thieves entered Call of Duty, because obviously there's the King Pappy, Black Ops 3, Aches roster that a lot of
Cannot be spoken of.
Thieves fans and Nade Shot probably want to forget. But
Their
that
prison
aside,
uniforms.
the Thieves' re-entrance into Call of Duty in Black Ops 4 was also a little rocky at the start, with when they had Pharaoh, and I think that it was Pharaoh, Slasher, Octane, Kenny, and Enable, and they were struggling because that's a lot of ARs on the team, and then they had to they somehow pulled it off at the last chance, or the Pro League qualifier, whatever it was called. But they ended up having to make the move because FaZe didn't qualify, so that's how they got Crowder and Priesta on loan. So after that, they won a couple championships in Black Ops 4, and that's what Thieves fans expect. Obviously it comes from the expectation set up by Nade Shot, being former OpTic, and Greenwall fans having high expectations for OpTic, similar to LA Thieves fans having high expectations for their favorite team as well. So disappointing in that regard, I would say, but it's just been one thing where it feels like no matter what they try to do, something's going wrong and they just can't put it all together. But who knows? Maybe this major is their chance to do that. They certainly have a tough task for the first round matchup against FaZe, but stranger things have happened in Vanguard. So uh, who knows what'll happen here.
Yeah, they've just been off and on, really hot and cold. I was just looking at their schedule, or their results in their schedule, and it's just ridiculous. They basically are win loss win loss win loss, and that's not conducive to a consistent consistent performance or consistent results. But they have, for their part, they have seemed to outperform their qualifying. So, I look at their major two qualifying where they, I believe they qualified in 12th place. I don't think they won a single match, and then they finished top 8 at the major. So maybe there's something to that. They also outperformed their major 3 qualifying because they qualified in 8th place and it ended up finishing 4th at the major. So maybe they are better on land. I think there is some credence to that. I believe they're in Los Angeles, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, those Cali teams typically do struggle online, but we'll have to see. They're going to have to perform pretty well, or hope that Minnesota and Florida and all of those teams below them just get double first rounded. Like, I don't think it's a very likely scenario that happens. So they're going to have to win probably 1 or 2 matches at least to just make sure that they can get to champs. And maybe they could figure it out there. But yeah, I think it seems like a roster construction issue at this point that they haven't made a roster change. They've just made these role swaps and stuff, and things aren't really that much different than they were earlier in the season. And I believe JCap had a tweet that said, they played horrifically in like 2 maps this past week, and I just think that there's just something wrong with the team that can probably only be solved by a roster change. And it's unfortunate that it's going to happen that way, likely going to happen that way, but that's just what happens with teams. There are very few teams in Call of Duty history that really have been able to work out all of their kinks and somehow become even better than they were before. We've seen even the best teams in the world have to make roster changes because they just can't figure out some of their weaknesses and they can't find the consistent form that they had before. So it's very likely that LAT won't be sticking with this roster in the off season, but they have to figure it out now. They have 2 events, maybe 1 event, depending on how well they do. But they have a big task in front of them, and they have to figure it out really soon. Let's talk about. So we talked about LAT, we talked about FaZe. Let's talk about London, because they've been a really interesting team to watch this season. I remember earlier in the year, I said they are definitively like the 3rd best team in the league because they are pretty much beating all of the other teams except FaZe and OpTic. Things aren't nearly as clear as they were back then, but they do seem to be a lot better. They have Gizmo back in the roster, and he seems to be playing. I think he's just a perfect fit for this roster, quite honestly. Nothing against Harry. I think he's a very good player as well. But Gizmos just seemed to slot into this team a lot better, and they performed consistently better with him than they did with Harry. What do you make of London? Because this is a pretty good time to kind of figure things out heading into the end of the season.
And it's a really good time to figure things out. And, this is obviously entirely speculation, but I feel like the Major 1 run and the Stage 4, or the Major 4 qualifiers so far that we've had, that's where we've seen the true London. After that, there were reports in the middle after Major 1 for during Major 2 qualifiers and Major 2 itself that Gizmo was running into personal issues, had whatever it was. I don't even remember if it was even more specific than that. There was stuff going on behind the scenes for Gizmo personally. He was underperforming earlier in the season. There was talks early on of him being like a favorite for Rookie of the Year. When initially heading into the season, many people had their eyes on Pred and Sib, rightfully so, I believe. Gizmo kind of snuck up at the beginning of the year and rose up those rookie rankings. But after that Major 1 in Major 2 qualifiers, Major 2 itself, Major 3 qualifiers, and Major 3, Gizmo obviously had the personal issues. Then he wasn't playing. Harry was playing for London. And now he's back for the Major 4 qualifiers and the rest of the season, seemingly. So I think that just goes to speak for whatever was going on behind the scenes undoubtedly had a major impact on this team, because it's night and day in comparison to how they were playing when Gizmo first started the season and now, and then that space in the middle, they were just not a good team and they were really struggling. So I think, at least I hope for Gizmo's sake personally, that everything's going well for him behind the scenes, and assuming, or I don't, speculating that that's the case, that just seems to be the most likely scenario and explanation for London figuring things out. We saw what they were capable of early in the season, and now it's kind of, their performance recently is reflective of that. I think before this most recent loss, I'm pretty sure the stat was that they were like undefeated in hardpoint, undefeated in search and destroy, and winless in control in the Major 4 qualifiers. It was something nutty like that. So they've just been playing really well. I believe due to the tiebreakers that they are technically the number 1 seed. Yeah, so they went 4-1. New York and Boston also went 4-1, and London and New York also went 14-7 in map count. So there was just some tiebreaker there, but London's the number 1 seed heading into this major, and based on their recent performance, it certainly seems like they've earned it. And it'll be interesting to see if they're able to translate it here on land, even though they did have that like top 3 performance early in the year. So they're in a position now where they certainly could go on a little bit of a run here, and based on recent performance, it wouldn't be too surprising. But I am someone who has been betting against London all year, and I don't think I'm going to be changing that. But I'd be happy if the London guys are able to make something happen.
Yeah, so they were undefeated in hardpoint search heading into the final qualifying match against LAG. Even with that 3-2 loss against the Gorillas, they were 9-1 in hardpoint, 5-1 in search and destroy, and 0-5 in control in the qualifiers, which is a pretty ludicrous thing to happen, because we're like, usually if you're decent in like hardpoint, you probably are decent in control. Like, there is some crossover between the respawn game modes usually. And some teams usually, if they're bad at control, they're probably bad at other things too. Like Paris is, I don't need to really look up the stats. I'm sure that they're a pretty bad control team because they're a pretty bad team. That's usually how it works. But this team, for whatever reason, they were excellent in hardpoint and excellent in search and destroy over those 5 matches. So technically it is a small sample size, but that's pretty amazing that they were, regardless of how bad they did in control, they were still able to win 4 of those 5 series, and they lost in a game 5 search, against LAG, which would have made them 5-0. So I think that there's a lot of promise with London. Will it translate over to the major? That's hard to say, because teams seem to struggle with the transition sometimes, even if they've had decent performances on land before. But we'll see how it goes. They have the Ultra in the first round, and Toronto, they struggled with hardpoint earlier in the season, but if they're able to pull it off, I don't know. I don't know what to think of Toronto. Let's talk about them real quick, because they were, we were really down on them earlier in the year when they were pretty much incapable of winning a single hardpoint. And then they improved greatly. They look like one of the better teams, like the Toronto that we knew from last season that seemed to show up. But what do you think of the Ultra now that they're coming in as the 8th seed, and they're relatively safe from the standings right now, but they're not technically safe.
Yeah, I just think they are one of the teams, obviously you talked about the Thieves not, wanting to play any more of those West Coast to East Coast online battles. I feel like I would have to look up the numbers to be sure, but I feel like Toronto is one of the teams that's probably happy about online Vanguard being over. Well, I mean, I'm sure all the teams are happy, but
Yeah.
I feel like Toronto in particular is one team that just performs better on land no matter what. So I think obviously they, like you said, it's been well documented their struggles in hardpoint. They've had moments where they've looked really good in search. And I still think Kleenex is just an absolute stud and one of the best players in the game. So Toronto certainly has the potential to go on a bit of a run and perform well on land in particular, but this is definitely a tough opening matchup for them. Like you said, 9-1 in hardpoint out of London recently. If they're able to just take, well, based on those records you were saying, 9-1 in hardpoint versus whatever Toronto is now, they still had a very tough stretch of hard points. So you expect London to take the hard points. On paper, you probably think Toronto is the better search and destroy team, but at the other hand, it was 5-1 you said for London and search and destroy recently.
Yeah.
So you can't even just automatically give Toronto the searches. But at the same time, with London 0-5 in control, you can't give London just that control. So I think it will come down to the searches, just based on math there. With even if you give London both hard points, Toronto has a good chance to win the control, and just based on their individual performance, they should be able to take a hard fought search, and then it would come down to a final search. In my eyes, at least that's how I could envision the series going. And I don't know who takes it, just based on, again, it's going recent performance versus historical performance of London and Toronto, respectively. So it's definitely a tough opening matchup for Toronto, but I think, this roster has been through a lot together. They have good chemistry, and they've certainly shown on land what they're capable of. So I don't know. We'll have to see which version of Toronto we get. I feel like I'm saying that for a lot of teams, but it's really just true. It's going to come down to whether they show up and put up here and one of the seasons on the line.
Yeah, so I'm looking at their both of these teams, so Toronto and London, their hard point and search and their control win-loss. Like I said, 9-1 in hard point, 5-1 in search, and 0-5 in control. That was London in the most recent qualifiers. If you are just looking at the last set of qualifiers for Toronto, they were 3-6 in hard point, 3-5 in search, and 3-2 in control. But if you expand it a little bit more to like just the back half of the season, which, I tend to disregard the first half of the season, like that's, 3 months ago now, like those results kind of mean very little to me in terms of like how these teams will end up playing now, like in the current meta and with however the teams have progressed as complete rosters. But I look at it and Toronto has a very good win-loss on hardpoint, I believe. A pretty good win-loss on search and destroy, flip those. So they're a little bit above average in hardpoint. They're very good in search, and then they're like kind of below average in control. They're 7-9 in control. So they kind of match up pretty well if London is able to keep up this kind of play on land, where they're very good in hardpoint and search, but really bad in control. It's kind of like the Toronto New York thing we saw earlier in the year, where both of those teams were absolutely horrendous in hardpoint, and it's kind of like, all right, which one of you is gonna suck less in this map to pull out a very crucial game one victory? So it could be a similar thing where these two teams are not great control teams, and that game three could be a major factor in the series in winners bracket round one between Toronto and London. Let's talk about, we have a few more teams to talk about. Let's talk about Boston, because this is a team that really surprised me this stage. Obviously, they bring in Vivid. They bench Capsidal, which is kind of a controversial move just because Cap has been a very good rookie for Boston this year, and they did have some success with him in the first half of the season. But I feel great that I was standing by Vivid so strong. I thought Vivid, kind of being excluded from this last iteration of the Florida roster was really bad, because I believe that Vivid is a good fit alongside some slower players, and I thought he should stick around. They decided to move him to Boston and, kind of rearrange their own team. And Boston has really benefited from it. Like you said, they're 4-1, so they tied for first place. They end up getting the second seed, which is incredible with how poorly they played in the Major 3 qualifiers. And, they didn't look very good in Major 3 as well. What have you been making of Boston's kind of this recent turnaround they've been experiencing?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest factor, the Vivid factor, kind of like you said. Not to say the Capsule was the issue by any stretch of the imagination, but it kind of feels like Vivid is finally unlocked on this team for whatever reason. I would have to look up his numbers specifically to back that up, but I just feel like in the matches I watched of Boston playing, he was performing pretty well.
Yeah.
And there's obviously outliers. I know Nero had one hard point that I'm thinking of, I'm pretty sure, where he dropped like 45 plus. And there was another match where like TJ was going off or something like that. So I can't remember the exact numbers, but that's just what what Boston is capable of with this team. It feels like they have a group of guys who at any given moment they can all go off and kind of carry the load, but the only issue with that is if they run into a situation where not one person is popping off and the rest of the team is falling behind and everybody's just struggling, obviously, that's not a good recipe for success. So it will be interesting to see how Boston carries on from these online qualifiers, but I do think it was, we kind of talked in the most recent roster mania, being unsure about some of the changes being made, but it seems like Vivid to Boston is certainly a change that has kind of unquestionably helped Boston improve no matter what, just in the short term so far. And on top of that, I will say too, kind of grouping them with Florida, who we'll inevitably talk about since we're going through all the teams. Florida made a big move to move on from Vivid and go for Major Maniac and 2 Real, and they've had kind of an up and down experience so far in the qualifiers, despite their 3-2 overall record. One element of that though was that Major Maniac revenge match against Minnesota. We got a revenge match here in the first round of the Major for Vivid going up against his former team. So that could be something to keep an eye on in the first round. I know I'll be excited to see if there's any trash talk or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that we can kind of lump these two teams together because they're connected by Vivid, and just how, these teams really were literally connected in an acquisition late in the season. But I look at it, and Vivid, I'm looking at the stats right now, comparing Vivid's stats from when he was on Florida to, whatever the 5 matches that we have with him on Boston. I think it should be noted that these two teams are very, very different. Florida is like very, very slow, and like slow but engagement heavy, which is odd. You'd usually think, they're really quick teams. They tend to have more engagements, but Boston right now. So Vivid, I'm looking at his stats. He has a slightly higher KD with Boston compared to Florida, a .98 versus a .91, but fewer engagements. He has per 10 minutes, 51.4 engagements versus 53.1, which was the highest on the team on Florida. Nero is the highest on the team for engagements because he's kind of like a speed demon as well. He's a really good player, so he's able to get a lot of kills. There's not much difference in the search and the control, but it's also just like a different role for Vivid. I think not being the only like fast SMG player, or just like the fast player in general, I think that's helped Vivid a lot in Boston. Whether that continues, obviously, and whether they're able to have the same success that they did in the qualifying matches, that remains to be seen. But I think that the move is probably a positive one for Boston, like no matter the outcome, because I think Vivid is a very good player, and maybe he could slot into that roster next year. You bring back Capsule, put him in the roster, and maybe figure out something else. But I think that Vivid is a great player, and I'm really happy to see him having success with a team like the Breach. But Florida, it's the same story that we've been talking about the entire year. They struggle at times, and then they do well at times. There's really no predicting how they do. I know that I've seen like Ogre 2 say something about it, like how people call us unpredictable, blah, blah, blah. But like, it's kind of true. Like it's very difficult to predict how they do. And maybe it's because they don't tend to beat those higher tier teams, like the phases of the world. But that also, I feel like they do underperform at times. I don't think that they perform up to the level that people expect them to. Maybe that's on us. Maybe we're putting too many expectations on the team. But what do you think of Florida now they're heading into this match with Boston?
I'm not sold on them, man. I really don't know what to believe about this team because we saw. I'm scrolling through real quick of their most recent matches. They lose to London. Makes sense based on London's performance, right?
Mm-hmm.
We know they beat Minnesota previously, so I think they played 2 matches before this. So Florida beats Paris again. That's kind of expected. And they beat LA Thieves, which might not have been expected, but yeah, I mean, even just looking at that, I don't really know. I feel like it's as cliche as it might be at this point for us to keep saying it. It's just really I don't know what to expect from Florida. It's going to come down to what version of the team we get. I still think personally, I don't know much about Too Real, but beyond what he's done so far in his young career this year. But I like the other guys on the team. I think very highly of Major Maniac. Outside of a statistic perspective, I think he's a really good search player and a good leader. I think highly of Awakening, just his slaying ability, and same with Skies. I think I've liked Skies as a player for a while now too, going back all the way back to those Luminosity days for him, getting his start really on Black Ops 4. Um, they have potential. They certainly have a lot of slaying potential. It's just all 3 of those guys I just named are really their most impactful when they have an AR in their hands, and on some of these maps that's just not possible. So it's weird, and I don't know what to expect, and I really it seems like I'm babbling at this point, but I'm at a loss for words, and not necessarily for a bad reason. I really don't have a solid answer or grasp on what to expect from Florida at this point. I feel like just based on where they're at in the standings and everything, I would not be surprised if they missed out on champs. But again, kind of like you said, they were that team. Major 2 went on a bit of a run, right? I think they got 4th place or top 6. I don't even remember. I feel like it had to have been 4th place. Regardless of that, though, like they're similar to teams like Seattle that we've talked about earlier in the show. You never know what you're going to get from the squad, and this is really just based on where they are in the CDL standings. This is an event they can't afford to not show up and perform well at if they have aspirations of being a champ. So it's really tough matchup in the opening round, like we already brought up, with them going up against Vivid, who's obviously going to be gunning for them as if he's Baker Mayfield playing the Browns in week 1. But it's I think tough one, and at the end of this major, I'm not going to be surprised if Florida's on the outside looking in.
What a shot to be taken. I don't know. All right, let's end the show now. As far as Florida goes, I think it's so fitting that they're so they went 3-2 in the qualifying matches. I mean, you can't technically go half in a 5-game or in 5 matches. Like you can't go 2.5 and 2.5, but I'm sure if they could, they would have. And Florida also in map count in the qualifying matches went 11-10. They are literally like hovering around this 50% win percentage in both map count and matches. And one of those 3-2 wins was over Paris. Like that's not an incredible feat, to be honest with you. I think that Florida definitely has the capability to get another top 4 finish. Like that's a realistic option for the Mutineers, but that it's also a realistic option that they lose to Boston and they lose to Seattle. And like I don't know which one is more likely at this point, to be honest, because they're a good team on their good days, and then they're not a real good team on their not so good days. I really don't know what to expect out of them, and it really is going to be an interesting matchup with them in Boston. Maybe Vivid, he drops like a 1.5 or something, and he really makes the Mutineers regret it. But we'll see. But yeah, that does it for all of those teams. I think you already kind of alluded to it earlier in the show, but I want to get your pick for the Major 4 winner. So just a reminder, July 14th to the 17th, they're going to be in Brooklyn. The New York Subliners are hosting it, so it would be an incredible story for Crim 6 to lead the Subliners to a major championship and very likely a CDL champs berth. But who are you picking to win Major 4?
Yep, that's try hard pick is FaZe. Maximum content / storylines pick is the Subliners.
Yeah, I would say I want to pick London because they've been very good, but they've also let me down pretty much. Like they if I pick them to lose, they win. If I pick them to win, they lose. It's kind of been a thing this entire year with you and me with how London has been playing. I don't believe in really many of these teams, like because we don't have we don't have the three major champions in the winners bracket, and I'm not going to go out on a limb and pick a losers bracket team to win the championship a la LAG. So I'm going to go with New York. They've been playing very well recently. I'm going to say that they break their curse of absolutely ruining their chances of getting to the postseason with another bad major performance. So I'm going to say that they're going to win. My brain is saying Atlanta, but I don't listen to my brain half the time anyway. So I'm going to go with the Subliners winning it from their home crowd, which would be an incredible thing for the CDL and for all of the Subliners fans. Anything else?
You want to just run through the bracket real quick and give our predictions for those 4, and then obviously we'll update it throughout the weekend. I'm going to go Toronto, FaZe, New York, and Boston.
Yeah, I'm going to go London, FaZe, New York, and Boston as well. And then losers bracket.
Well, we don't have to do that yet. We can wait until.
All right, yeah.
That's solid. So I'm doing Toronto.
Well, I'll go out on a limb and say
Atlanta,
that the loser of
New York.
LAT Atlanta beats Paris. So
Wow, that's really bold. I don't know if you want to do that.
yeah,
So the only one you had different, you said London, Atlanta, New York, and Boston?
yeah.
Okay, cool. So the only one we had different to start is that top one. But you know me, I can't pick London.
Yeah. I think that about does it. We went through all of the qualifying matches. We talked about all of these teams. We went through the major, just a reminder on the standings as we head into Major 4 before we get out of here. Number 1 is FaZe and number 2 is OpTic. Both of those teams have qualified for champs. And then the Paris Legion are down in 12th. They are officially eliminated from contention. So teams 3 through 11 are still in contention for champs, and also still in contention to not be in contention come next week. So the third team is London, 4th Seattle, 5th Boston, 6th Toronto, 7th LAT, 8th LAG, and LAG have a 5-point lead over Minnesota and Florida, and then a 35-point lead over the New York Subliners, who are definitely going to win Major 4 and make me look very, very smart come next week's episode. But yeah, that about does it for the show. We went a little longer than we usually do, about 15-20 minutes longer than usual, but we hope you enjoy the episode. We hope you enjoy Major 4, the final major of the 2022 CDL season, and the last tournament or last matches before CDL champs, which is coming up very soon, within a month. So yeah, enjoy it. Hopefully there aren't like 11-hour delays during this tournament, but no promises there. Make sure to subscribe or like or follow the feed on whatever platform you're listening or watching on. We're on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, etc. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating whenever you can. So if you're on Apple or Spotify, make sure to do that. Follow us on Twitter. He is at jbink with 2 Ks. I'm at Preston Byers, and the podcast Twitter is at Ego Chall Podcast. The next show is on July 18th, which that's probably going to be the exact day. So that's a Monday. So next Monday. And then we'll have to fill a little bit of time before champs starts, which is in August. But we should have a lot to talk about next week. We'll know exactly which 8 teams qualify for champs, which 4 teams will be starting their off-season early. But yeah, we will talk about that then. Bink, take it away.
Yep. Thank you guys, as always, for tuning in. We appreciate the support. Vanguard season is quickly coming to an end here, but we still have this major this weekend and champs to look forward to, so not all hope is lost just yet. Looking forward to some good Call of Duty this weekend and to round out the season. So if for whatever reason you're unable to watch the matches, or if you do watch the matches and want some more analysis or whatnot, just 2 guys talking about the matches that happen. Hopefully you guys tune back in following the major next week, and then I will be going on vacation for a little bit, but we will obviously have a show at some point before champs to preview that, in addition to whatever we talk about next week following the major and once we know all 8 teams there. So looking forward to wrapping up the season with you guys. Hope you enjoy, and as always, remember to send the chow.